Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this policy forum organized by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I have the distinct pleasure and honor of hosting General David Petraeus for this special program that we mark the 20th anniversary of regime change in Iraq in a military operation led by the United States that toppled the Baathist regime in Iraq, which resulted in part to an elected government, followed by a constitution that was voted in a referendum by the Iraqi people. The path since has been rocky. The United States remains engaged in Iraq, often in a firefighting position. Unlike Afghanistan, there is still military and diplomatic relations between Iraq and the United States. And that military relationship has become the foundation for a robust future relationship that is not only military, but expands to diplomatic, economic, and cultural ties. As the saying goes, it might be too early to say and assess this 20-year enterprise and endeavor that the United States carried out in Iraq. But this is a historical moment that we're going to debate first, the first 45 minutes with General Petraeus. And then after that, I'll turn to my Washington Institute colleagues, Anna Borshchevskaya and Mike Knights, to first dissect some of the ideas and insights that the General will kindly share with us, as well as discuss some of the challenges on the ground that we think Iraq is faced with. General, it's a distinct honor. Thank you so much for making the time for us. You really need no introduction, so I'm not going to introduce you. But you have been at the heart of this endeavor of the U.S. Iraq relationship, both in your military capacity and civilian capacity. So 20 years on, what do you think is the legacy of this war?
Well, as you noted, still too early to tell, Bilal. It certainly has not been what we hoped it would be. I was a two-star general when we invaded Iraq. I was commanding the Great 101st Airborne Division during the fight to Baghdad. We liberated the first major city, Najaf, the holiest city in Shia Islam. I remember then calling up my boss and I said, I have good news and bad news. The good news is that we own Najaf. The bad news is that we own Najaf. And it was a precursor to what would follow, because not only did the regime leadership within Najaf, the government, the senior government officials leave, everyone disappeared. So we literally did own Najaf. And ultimately, of course, in many respects, we owned Iraq. What we had been told to expect, which is, we'd topple Saddam, his immediate regime members and so forth, and the rest of the government, at least the bureaucracy, would remain, did not prove out. And this was one of the reasons why within the first 2 weeks, I was asking rhetorically my embedded reporter, Rick Atkinson, tell me how this ends. We thought we knew how it ended after the surge in Iraq. Of course, I was privileged to come back and first as a two-star, we went north to Mosul. As you'll recall, we were responsible for Nineveh and then also overseeing the activities that we had in the 3 Kurdish provinces. Came back as a 3-star to establish the train and equip mission, came back as a 4-star to command the surge. And we really felt that after the surge, having driven violence down by nearly 90%, pulling the country literally out of a Sunni Shia civil war, and watching it for 3.5 years after that on a pretty good path. Actually, violence continued to go down marginally. After that, it seemed as if the politics were somewhat coming together, still very difficult, still very fractious, contentious, still bureaucratic, inefficient, corrupt, political nepotism, inadequate basic service, but generally, again, a country that seemed to have reasonable prospects until that fateful moment, literally within 24 hours of the withdrawal of our final 4-star commander and our final combat troops, noting that there was still a 3-star and a training mission. But the 4-star was gone, who is Lloyd Austin, of course, now our Secretary of Defense. And I actually showed up within 24 hours of that as the director of the CIA, and it was as if I'd arrived at the beginning of the surge again because of the actions Prime Minister Maliki took that literally undid so much of what it was we'd worked and sacrificed so much to achieve together during the 19 and a half months that I was privileged to be his partner as the commander of the surge. And his highly sectarian actions tore the fabric of society apart, took the eyes of the Iraqi security forces off of the Islamic State, by then no longer the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which we had actually destroyed during the surge, ultimately gave a reason for the Shia militia to put uniforms back on and reemerge, having we defeated them in 2008 in the battles of Basra and Sadr City. And it all really fell apart again. Unfortunately, then, of course, we went back in. Ironically, the administration that didn't want to leave 5,000 troops there without a status of forces agreement had 5,000 troops when they left office, helping the Iraqi security forces and then the Syrian Democratic Forces eliminate the caliphate. And ever since then, really, it's just been a series of dramatic events with drama after drama. That said, as we were discussing before we went on air, having both met Prime Minister Saddam, I saw him most recently in Munich a couple of months ago, I'm somewhat heartened for this moment. You have a prime minister who I think is quite a skilled political figure. He's navigating these various centrifugal forces trying to pull the country apart, including the influence by Iran, which would still like to Lebanonize Iraq to control the parliament and to have a powerful militia on the streets the way that it does in Lebanon. But also the challenges with many understandable with the Kurdish regional government and with the Sunni Arab population, and frankly, with a young population that is just not satisfied with the economic opportunities they have, and with a citizenry at large that is unsatisfied with the fact that the land of the two rivers can't provide adequate drinking water for its people. And one of the top 3 or 4 oil exporters in the world, again, can't provide 24-hour power. But it seems as if he may be able to navigate some of these issues. I thought he was very courageous in stating that he wanted U.S. forces to stay. It wasn't some kind of backroom deal. He came out and said it. We are there in a modest way. That is, as you note, probably the foundation of it. And Iraq recognizes the need for a continued U.S. support militarily, also with intelligence assets to keep an eye and pressure on the Islamic State, also where necessary to deal with other challenges inside the country and so forth. So again, touch wood, because with high oil prices, with a recognition, I think, by all in politics, even if they're involved in this political nepotism and so forth, that they have to do better for the Iraqi people. I just have some sense that that might actually be the path forward.
General, I definitely share your optimism, but let me play the devil's advocate here. One of the terms that gets tossed around about the when evaluating the war, and I agree with you, it's probably too soon to call, is that the United States won the war, but Iran won the peace, or put differently, Iraq was handed to Iran on a silver platter. As the United States seemed to be engaged elsewhere, the war in Ukraine, great power competition, but also the war itself seems to have a bad rep, especially after the endeavors of the Arab Spring. How can this movement, this particular movement that you articulated quite positively, how can that military presence be in the advantage of the United States' interests in Iraq, rather than this is the United States military subsidizing a government that's ultimately not going to work in a fashion that is good for its relationship with the United States?
Well, first of all, I should acknowledge we made tons of mistakes during the war years as well. I mean, not the least of which was an intelligence assessment that turned out to be unfounded, which was one of the major bases for the invasion. Then truly really catastrophic policy decisions very early on, firing the military without telling them what their future was and how we would help them provide for their families. And of course, firing the Ba'ath Party down to and including level 4 Baathists, which are basically bureaucrats, most of which were educated in the West, which we really needed and should have wanted. Certainly get rid of Saddam, his number 2, and even level 3, perhaps. But level 4, we actually, I mean, that was 110 or 120 tenured professors just in Mosul University alone, we were given, thankfully, I had the authority in there because there was no reconciliation process. Certainly, there needed to be demobilization, disarmament, but reintegration, those kinds of DDR, that's necessary. And certainly there needed to be toppling of that regime, but you need to keep the rank and file, who were basically not in this because of vast ideological commitment or conviction, at least to get you through the years and running that country, as was the case. And I think we made some very serious errors early on, and we didn't really rectify a lot of those in a structured, organized way until the surge in Iraq, when we conducted true reconciliation as part of the Sons of Iraq, the Sahwa, the Anbar Awakening, which we spread all up and down both the Tigris and Euphrates River valleys. And when it comes to, you ask about U.S. national interest, look, it's our national interest that number one, the problems in one of the country that has so many different ethnic, sectarian, tribal, political, and other fault lines running through it, itself stay stable. And then moreover, that they don't expand to cause challenges in other countries, because we know that one of the truisms of the Middle East is that what happens there doesn't stay there. It tends to spew violence, extremism, instability, and in some cases, a tsunami of refugees, not just into neighboring countries, but all the way into the countries of our major allies in Europe and elsewhere in the world. So again, from just a strictly realist perspective, I think that would be, and this is before we get into the more lofty aspirations that we once might have held about, again, democracy and free market capitalism and the rest, which I subscribe to, but which I also think we have come to realize need to be very considerably tempered, frankly. This whole episode, not just here, but the Arab Spring as well, does bring to mind for me from time to time a saying that I believe is attributed to Bernard Lewis, the great Princeton professor, who used to say that democracy in the Middle East is strong medicine. It should be administered small doses at a time, or something to that effect. Now, don't get me wrong. I am a huge believer, along with Churchill, that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. I am a great believer academically as well as philosophically in the virtues of capitalism and free market economics, and again, freely elected and participation and so forth. But again, we also have to be realistic. And I think our realism has been considerably tempered by our experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also in Libya and then in the other countries where we saw the Arab Spring. And the truth is that now none of those, it used to be that Tunisia at least stood out as an example of a case where it was proceeding forward in a somewhat hopeful manner. Now, even there, you see a very highly authoritarian government taking the reins of power in a very substantial manner. So again, what are our objectives here? First and foremost is just to help the country itself, help it get through keep these centrifugal forces from pulling it apart, help it make the most of the centripetal force, which of course the most important of which is the central government's ability to allocate the resources, in particular, obviously those from export of crude oil, but also some others, and then to help that country forward, and above all, not allow it to be an incubator of Islamist extremists, again, as was the case when the Iraqi security forces took their eye off the Islamic State while they were focused on Sunni Arab demonstrators in the wake of Prime Minister Maliki's highly sectarian actions against the Sunni Arab vice president, finance minister, and parliamentarian from Anbar. So to do all of that, certainly, but there are many other potential challenges there in a country that actually should be the Japan of the Middle East, which is how the Iraqis used to describe their aspirations when I was a two-star walking the streets of Mosul. And when they still believe that, U.S., you can put a man on the moon, just give me a job. Why can't you do that? And so, again, we've obviously evolved from all of that. I will end with one final anecdote from walking the streets of Mosul, where the citizens would come up. And of course, as the occupying force commander for that initial year or so, a two-star general in his division area of responsibility is the executive, judicial, and legislative all in one. And now, yes, we got a council going, we got a variety of institutions revived. But at the end of the day, I was the sheikh of the strongest tribe in Iraq, in northern Iraq at least, and the citizens of Nainawa province knew that. And they would come up to me and they would say, General Petraeus and God bless America, God bless George Bush, God bless democracy. What is it?
Well, I think now Iraqis know what is it. My worry about Iraqi democracy is that it hasn't delivered to those aspirations that those sheikhs were telling you. And the example of Tunisia is quite apt. That when democracy doesn't deliver, then people go back to other more tried and failed methods.
And that is, if I could, Bilal, that's why clearly, certainly, maybe the foundation or the cornerstone, the keystone, whatever it is in the relationship, may be the assistance we're providing to the Iraqi security forces, the Iraqi intelligence service, the counterterrorism service, to, again, keep an eye on, above all, on Islamist extremists, which are now no longer an army, as ISIS was at one point, or a caliphate, but still, there is still certainly residual the insurgent elements and terrorist elements, and in some degree of the virtual caliphate still out in cyberspace as well, and also on the more destructive other forces, those militia, those that are causing serious problems, and figuring out how to accommodate them. But also, I think we shouldn't stop there. I think we should quietly, within the means and within the desires of the Iraqi government and key political figures, we should be helping them as we can with various forms of expertise and so forth. And that should not stop, and it hasn't. And I know that you engage with our diplomats and others there, and development workers and intelligence officers and others, and they're all, again, but I think it's being done with a degree of intellectual modesty, if you will, or is certainly not the kind of hubris that we might have had at some points along in this endeavor.
General, allow me to spend 1 minute on some housekeeping. For those of you joining us via Zoom, please use the Zoom's Q&A function. For those of you joining us by YouTube or through our website, please feel free to send your questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Policyforum, one word, @washingtoninstitute.org. I already have a question for you, General. This comes from Iraqi political satirist Ahmed al-Bashir about the point you mentioned on Sahawat. That was, I think, the first example of U.S. military partnership with a local force. I mean, post-Saddam, there was an alliance with the Peshmerga before, to defeat Al-Qaeda at the time. That became also the model later for how the United States led the coalition that defeated ISIS. But many seem to wonder, if not complain, what happened to the Sahawat? Where did the United States drop the ball on them? Why didn't they become part of the formal armed forces?
Yeah, it's a good question. And let me just explain how this actually worked, because we didn't go out and actually hire guns, if you will. We had carried out reconciliation in the past with former Baathists. It started in Mosul. We had many, many thousands. We would have reconciliation ceremonies because, again, remember, there was no formal reconciliation mechanism. So they basically fired tens of thousands of Baath level 4s and above. Again, all the people we needed to run the government, and most of them Western educated. Some of them drank, for goodness sake. They were that secular. And here we've thrown them all in the ash heap of history. And by the way, they can get a job nowhere else in Iraq, especially as a professor, because all universities are state-owned. And by the way, ironically, unless they go to the Kurdish region, which was happy to pluck some of the senior tenured professors from Mosul University. So we needed them back. So we reconciled with them. It worked for a period of time in Mosul, the only place where we had the authority to do it. Unfortunately, Dr. Shalaby would not approve our recommendations. He waited until after I left that first year, disapproved them, and it started to spiral downward like the other locations. There were other efforts at reconciliation, in other words, with former Baathists, not all of whom by any means were all Sunni, as you will recall. There were a number of Shia as well. General McMaster did something small with that in Tal Afar in 2005, I think it was, there was an effort out in Anbar province with a number of sheikhs out there who reconciled. The idea was that as it progressed, that they were no longer just being reconciled from being Baathist. Now it was that they were being reconciled from having been part of the insurgent movement or the Shia militia over time as well. And the bottom line was that we said, look, don't you want to get al-Qaeda out of your area? Because, of course, al-Qaeda became increasingly oppressive, violent, murderous, and so forth. And over time they did, because they realized they're missing out on everything else that's taking place in Iraq. We pulled them away from that. And it was only over time, though, that we actually then started to put orange road guard vests on them and actually use them for basically static security. They were not on the front lines. These were not forces by and large. Now, the forces that we did use, we brought in through the Iraqi police, through an academy, started in Ramadi. And keep in mind that this Sahwa, the one that we ultimately built on, started in the fall of 2006. The surge began in early February of 2007, but I'd heard about it, and I was very intent on expanding it. It was just outside Ramadi initially. What it initially meant was that they would no longer support al-Qaeda, tacitly or actively, or the insurgent groups. And then over time, we did start to incorporate them again in the Iraqi police service and others. Then over time further, when we had the authority to pay them modest salaries, about half that of a soldier, we could use them literally just to guard a road intersection, again, and so forth. But it was really the point that we're pulling them away from the insurgency. They're now supporting us initially, and then ultimately the new Iraq. Now, as this went on, this was 103,000 individuals over time, 80,000 former Sunni insurgents and others, and then about 23,000 that were members of the Shia militia, a number of those that were supported by Iran. Now, by the way, another element of our policy was that we pursued the irreconcilables even more relentlessly with our special mission units. These were the leaders of al-Qaeda in Iraq, of the major Sunni insurgent movements and the major Shia militias supported by Iran. This 103,000 we did look after for a long period of time. And then what we tried to do was, for those who qualified, the problem was that many of them did not meet the educational criteria to join the police or the military. So there were education opportunities, so civilian education, there were job training opportunities, and there were a host of other actions, which we did initially. Prime Minister Maliki did pick up to a degree, and then, frankly, after we left, a lot of those promises were not met either. And that's how this all sort of transpired, and that was very disappointing to watch as well. And then coupled with the actions against the most senior Sunni political figures in government, preferring charges against them and their security details, alienated the Sunnis, tore the fabric of society that we'd worked so hard to bring back together during the surge and the subsequent 3.5 years. And then it started it all over again. And that was absolutely tragic. And I was watching it real time because I was a CIA director at the time. And as I mentioned, was the first person in after the initial action that he took in mid-December of 2011.
General, two questions about perhaps two issues that are internal to Iraq and continue to cause major problems. and one of them is the challenge of militias. So the
Yes.
surge that you led was quite successful in wiping out Al-Qaeda. And then later on in 2014, despite, even after the Sahawats were dismantled and the U.S. withdrew much of its combat forces at the end of 2011, ISIS captured a third of the country.
Yep.
But the United States was again quick into action, led an international coalition, and liberated Iraq and then later Syria from ISIS. So against those two success stories, how come the U.S. hasn't had that level of success against the militias? Or put differently, is there a U.S. solution to the militia problem the same way that there has been a U.S. solution to the Al-Qaeda and the ISIS non-state actors?
The short answer at this point is no, but let me remind you and the audience that we did destroy the Shia militia. The Battle of Basra, the Battle of Sadr City, the Battle of Qadamiyya, and a number of other battles in what we termed Iraqi March Madness back in 2008. It was not the basketball madness, it was serious fighting that was launched when, remember, Prime Minister Maliki quite impulsively and suddenly decided to deploy 2 Iraqi divisions to Basra without logistical preparations, without their advisor teams. Caught us really a bit flat-footed. We had some notice, but not sufficient. We did pledge to support him. And then he went and positioned himself in the former Saddam palace in Basra, where he became surrounded, and his actual Brigadier General Security Force commander got killed. So this is how desperate that was. We ultimately got the advisors down, moved all the drones and close air support and intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets down there, helped them bring other forces in, solve the logistical issues, and destroyed the militia in the Battle of Basra. That followed then what followed was the Battle of Sadr City. That was, again, a very, very substantial fight. Defeated them, didn't destroy them completely, but they certainly very much surrendered, capitulated. The rockets on the embassy and so forth in the Green Zone stopped for a long time. And again, many other locations where they dared to rear their head. And they really did not reappear until after the return of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, now the Islamic State, which was another reason why it was so tragic that the Islamic State gave a reason. And you'll remember that Grand Ayatollah Sistani even said, now is the time to come to the aid of our country. And if you're a militia, you can put your uniform on and come back on the streets. And we do need to acknowledge that they did serve quite courageously alongside Iraqi security forces in defeating the Islamic State, something that was difficult for us as we're trying to help the security forces, but not the militias. And of course, you have the IRGC Quds Force leader, publicly doing selfies with these militias and so forth. The problem now is, of course, that they are really a part of the security firmament. It's a very different situation than it was before the reconstitution of ISIS and the establishment of the caliphate. And the context is just transformed in that regard. So now prime ministers, who are the commander-in-chief, have them as part of the security force landscape and has to figure out how to deal with them, how to keep them from becoming what Hezbollah has become in Lebanon, and to keep their political affiliates or allies from becoming in the parliament what the Hezbollah coalition has in Beirut as well.
Thank you, General. Another question also about issues that the United States probably hasn't had much luck with, and those are America's friends. So a two-there here. Who do you think are America's friends in Iraq? And I assume that you will list the Kurds or the KRG as one of them. If in that case, what can we do when Washington's friends basically engage in internal divisions and scoring own goals? How can we stop our friends from shooting themselves in the leg?
Well, first of all, I would submit that we have friends across the spectrum in Iraq. That includes very much lots and lots of friends in the majority of the country, which is the Shia Arabs. We've got plenty of friends in the Sunni Arabs. We've got friends in the Christians, the Turkmen, the Yazidis, the Shabak, you name it, and certainly our friends in the mountains, the Kurds. And again, as I would frequently remind them, they do have other friends than the mountains, and they should count them as the Americans. That doesn't mean that friendship is sort of completely, without some qualifications at times. But the frustrations, I think, of the United States with all of our friends there. I mean, what you're doing is, frankly, trying to walk me into saying that the Kurds and the Kurdish region, which still features very considerable division, a concentration of power, certain degrees of state involvement in the economy to a considerable extent, allegations of corruption, et cetera, et cetera. We see that sadly, really throughout the country. And we need to politely, honestly call that out, not necessarily always publicly, certainly. But no, I think one of the frustrations has been that so many areas the hopes have not materialized in the way that we certainly thought they would, actually. If you would have asked me whether the KRG would be as it is right now, I'm not sure that I would have said that. Certainly 20 years ago, in the extraordinary day when we celebrated July 4th, 2003, in the stadium in Erbil, with Kak Massoud right there, and then went over and celebrated it with Jalal Talabani.
General, I have two questions from the audience that are quite the opposites of each other. One of them from Steve Daniels says, the mistakes that the general referenced, were they military, political, or otherwise? The other question is from an anonymous listener who says, when are we going to stop blaming the United States mistakes and look at what mistakes the Iraqi side did?
Well, the mistakes and some of the successes, I would point out, some of the victories were across the board. Certainly the two major policy decisions that I highlighted were political. Again, the idea of firing the military without telling them what their future was, which just set the country into weekly paroxysms of violence that became so severe that after week 5, I had to talk down a crowd of 10 to 15,000, some of whom were armed, former soldiers, in the square outside the government center in Mosul, and said, I will go to the airport right after this. I will fly to Baghdad tonight. I will convey your concerns. I mean, we had to do that. And then thankfully, the Coalition Provisional Authority announced that there would be stipends, but we'd lost 5 weeks. That was the seeds of the insurgency. These were individuals who had military training, largely went home with their weapons when the forces collapsed. And that was a political decision that was very ill-advised. And then the de-Baathification, again, without an agreed reconciliation process. There needed to be de-Baathification, just as there needed to be disarmament, demobilization, reintegration. But you need to do it in a process, and there needed to be a hope for those. There was no reason to go down to level 4, in my view. That included tens of thousands of additional, again, basically bureaucrats. Again, 110, 120 professors. I mean, and again, most of them educated in the US and the UK. That's what we wanted for the future of Iraq, to replace, again, the kleptocratic, autocratic, murderous regime figures of Saddam Hussein's era. So again, that was very clearly, but there were military mistakes. Again, Abu Ghraib has to be laid at the feet of the military. That's an indelible image. Those photos will haunt us forever. And it was a failure. And there were other mistakes that we made. Inevitably, there are many mistakes in war that militaries make. I'd like to think that we were a learning organization, and that in Iraq in particular, by the time we did the surge, we'd actually tried to distill what we needed to do, counterinsurgency field manual. Now we get to implement it. And again, did pull the country out of this civil war and did provide a 3.5-year opportunity that was really quite extraordinary for the country. On the other hand, were there Iraqi mistakes? Of course there were. I mean, we've been discussing these. And of course there were abuses. And again, highly sectarian, highly ethnic, highly tribal, highly political even within different entities. I mean, the competition between the Shia political parties, particularly intense, because of course they represented the population that was the majority of the country. So yeah, there's more than enough blame, if you will, more than enough shortcomings, missteps, mistakes, I think, to lay at the feet of all those that were part of this, and I'm included among those. I recently noted one of the big regrets I have is that we didn't see as early as we should have that certain Shia militia were beginning to take control of some of the Iraqi security force units that we were very rapidly trying to stand up and train, particularly those within the police commando organization. But at least when I came back as the commander of the surge, I was able to have the prime minister fire every single, the 3-star, all the 2-stars, every one of the brigadier generals who were the brigade commanders before we would reconstitute those units. The tragedy was that ultimately, several years later, after we left, he put some of those back in charge, including those that proved to be as cowardly and as poor leaders as we expected in the Battle of Nainawa province, when the Islamic State came in and swept a force that was larger than they were and should have been able to deal with them. So yeah, look, there have been plenty of mistakes. There's a lot of that to go around. There's probably no element in Iraq that, again, wouldn't acknowledge, I think, even as well, that they indeed did make mistakes and had missteps along the way.
General, as we were chatting before we got on air, I told you I was in Iraq recently, and one of the sentiments that I felt there is a sense of Iraqi agency, that these are Iraqi problems in search for Iraqi solutions.
Yes.
And the United States can not go there and micromanage solutions, but actually just support those Iraqi solutions. Now, we talked a lot about politics and also military endeavors and relations. But I think one aspect of the U.S. Iraq relationship that is, very tertiary to these two has been the economic and the business ties. From your vantage point right now, what would it take for Iraq and the United States to build on the current military and diplomatic relationship, a robust economic and trade relationship? Why American business, put differently, has been shying away from Iraqi markets?
Well, and again, I should remind the audience, I'm a partner in one of the world's major investment firms. We own 120 companies around the world, have minority investments in another 100. We manage over $500 billion, again, around the world. And I chair the Global Institute within that firm that actually examines the kind of risks that are present, sadly, in Iraq and a number of other countries in the world. But again, what we do is we identify the geopolitical, the governance, the rule of law, macroeconomic, and so forth. There's several of us, actually. There's a macro team, there's environmental social governance, again, governance, rule of law, the political structures and so forth, the geopolitical security and so forth. And the challenge is that there are still significant obstacles in Iraq in each one of these different areas. And in fact, frankly, they've gone up or gone down. But again, what we look for in a country before we will seriously engage in diligence on a potential deal is there the rule of law? Is there governmental integrity? Is the governance, is the bureaucracy, does it function well? Do we trust and like those with whom we are going to do business? And we try to ensure that they trust and like us, if you will. So there are good relationships. Is the security situation solid? And again, we can just keep going down that list. And this is before, actually, we get into the merits of the actual business proposition. And of course, we look for big deals. We don't do little deals. Again, if you're managing $500 billion, you don't do venture capital. You do substantial, major deals. And the challenge is that when you put all those issues together, when you examine them, Unfortunately, the conditions are not present for a firm like KKR to make investments there. The challenges are just too substantial. Keep in mind, again, the money we're managing is that of pension funds in the United States. These are our teachers, our firefighters, the professors, the city municipal workers, the college endowments. Again, we feel a huge sense of responsibility to them. And again, we've got to take care of their retirement funds and do better for them. And so therefore, if you see the kinds of challenges that tragically, sadly, we see in Iraq, then you draw back from it rather than enthusiastically going in after it. That's not to say that businesses can't do major deals there. Certainly the oil companies, there's a variety of different elements that have done deals, but a number of them have had very frustrating experiences as well, as you well know. And sometimes in all parts of the country, including in the north.
General, in the few minutes that I have of your time, with which you've been very gracious, let me zoom out a little bit. So Iraqis here pivot to Asia, and then they heard America first, and now they hear great power competition, and then of course Iraq is not all that attractive for business, and they have given American diplomats and American military a hard time at times, or elements of the Iraqi government. So for our Iraqi and American audience, what is the right level of attention and investment that the United States should deploy in Iraq moving forward?
First of all, I would just say that I think that the term pivot was always a bad one, because it implies that you're just pivoting away. And the more accurate term was rebalance. Certainly, rightly, I think, understandably. With the emergence of challenges in the Indo-Pacific region, as it's termed, we needed to spend much more time, energy, emphasis, resources to focus on that than on the Middle East. But that didn't mean that you don't still stay engaged quite significantly in the Middle East. And I would contend that we have. You look at the commitment, the resources, the base structure, all the rest of this, it is very significant still. So first of all, again, I think that's the correct way to look at this. And there is a keen recognition, as I noted earlier, that again, Las Vegas rules do not apply in the Middle East. What happens there doesn't stay there. It tends to spew problems elsewhere. And so we want to, number one, prevent those problems. Number two, if necessary, contain them, help countries deal with them, et cetera. And we've seen what happens, by the way, when we do not do that. Our hesitation in Syria, our reluctance to engage, the red line that wasn't a red line, and the result was the rise of ISIS. Again, yes, it started in Iraq, but it really gained its power in the Syrian civil war. We saw this extraordinary number of refugees fleeing the Syrian civil war, causing enormous challenges, the biggest domestic political challenges probably in Europe at that point in time for a long period, not to mention the extremist issues that evolved from that and all the other humanitarian difficulties. So I think there's a recognition of that. There's also, and maybe I feel this more than most, if you spend 4 years in the land of the two rivers, there's something that does get in you. I remember one of the prime ministers, when I was leaving after my 3-star tour, he said, General, you may leave Iraq, but Iraq will never leave you. And that's true, I think, for all of us who were privileged to serve in Iraq over the years. I often say on an Iraqi, or on a Moslawi even. I think it's Moslawi, not Mosuli. I know there's some debate about that. But again, there's a huge affinity. There's an affection for the Iraqi people, this wonderfully hospitable people, for that country, ancient Mesopotamia, having liberated it, if you will, and then re-liberated it and so forth. So I don't think that we're just, shifting away. I think there is a recognition of the importance of the land of the two rivers and of the other countries in the region, our longtime allies and partners there, everything from the Gulf states to Israel. So these are long-standing partnerships. They have weathered ups and downs. They've gone through periods where there was political friction between Washington and whatever capital was out there. And I'm actually confident that that will continue to be the case because there are far more issues on which we have common interests and where there's convergence of respective national interests than there are differences that might try to pull us apart.
General, lastly, I'm gonna do something probably that's not, which is not fair. We've been talking about the past 20 years and marking it, but I'm gonna ask you to look into the future a little bit and tell us, where do you see this relationship in the next 20 years?
You know, I hope that it builds on this particular moment, which again, you and I both have watched this for decades and have a sense that there is a possibility here that hasn't actually been present maybe since late 2011 when Prime Minister Maliki took the actions that unhinged so much of it and set off the events that followed, and then the Islamic State, and then the resurgence of the militias, and then the very turbulent political periods. That maybe this could be the point where, again, those in government, led by a very, very skilled, I think you termed him a shrewd political figure, with admiration. That's what Iraq needs, and that he can guide them through this period, provide improved basic services, better educational opportunities, enhanced economic opportunities as well, and get the country again going in an upward spiral rather than in a downward or meandering one. And the United States, I think, still feeling very much there are still hopes. So many Americans have engaged in this project since 2003 and want this to succeed for a whole variety of reasons, not just the universal desire to see other human beings do well and prosper and live good lives and enable their children to do better than they did and live the Iraqi dream.
I'm going to say amen to that, General. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to host you at the Washington Institute. And happy Easter to you, sir, to you and to your family.
Thank you very much. Great to be with you, Bilal.
Thank you, General.
Ma salama.
Ma salama, Khwa Hafiz. And now we're going to turn to a panel here with my Washington Institute colleagues. There was obviously a lot to chew at. I think the General shared very interesting insights, both historical, military, as well as in his current position in Wall Street. So what we try to do for the next 45 minutes is engage in a conversation. We all are Iraq watchers from different angles. Mike looks at Mike Knight's Iraq. That's his Twitter handle. So it's right there. You're stuck with it. You've been looking at the military situation all the way from the beginning of the war, the war against Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and now you run our militia spotlight. Anna, you have this bird's eye view of what Iraq fits in a Middle East that feels the worries of the three terms that I mentioned, pivot to Asia, America first, and especially great power competition, a region that is used to vacuums that are not really filled by agents that we like every time we create one, but by agents that or actors that we probably don't like very much. So as we mark the 20th anniversary of the war and we look at the challenges, I would like us to look perhaps more into the future, this moment, but also the future. Mike, I'm going to start with you. The two challenges, I would posit that the three main challenges that Iraq currently faces, and the General referred to them as well. I think number one is corruption. It's the one topic that keeps coming up at my dinners with family, my high school buddies, college friends. But then you also go to an event like the like Soleimani Forum. That's still one of the main topics. You watch Iraqi TV, Kurdish TV, it's one of the topics. And I think it got to a point, especially thanks to Tishreen, that we've had two prime ministers who have elevated the challenge of corruption to be, now that ISIS basically has been defeated or is in back foot, corruption being the top problem. The third one I would posit would be climate change, and Iraq itself is a climate offender, with the flaring of the gas, with the all of the diesel that's being burned to generate electricity, but also for mismanagement of the water resources. So the country itself, while it's an offender, is actually disproportionately impacted by climate change, as some of the climate experts like Alwash and others have pointed out. But then, perhaps second to corruption, is the question of militias, who really pose and challenge the legitimacy of the state, the sovereignty of Iraq. So let me posit a larger question. So you've seen these ebbs and flows of security and stability, and the general mentioned that we are going through an eerie moment of quiet. How confident should we be in this particular quiet moment, in this current truce?
Thanks for having me. How's that now? Good. I don't think we should be very confident in this quiet moment at all. We've had quiet moments before, and those moments have often been used by negative actors to hollow out institutions and to work in the shadows. And I think this is happening today to a greater extent than ever before. You know, myself and Crispin Smith recently wrote a piece in Just Security that talked about the new regime change in Iraq, which is really what's happened over the last 18 months, where we went from overturning the result of a democratic election, the losers in that election ending up taking over the country, the complete politicization of the judiciary, and the great increase in power that militia actors have got. Now they're on the edge of forming a company, the Mohandis company. Well, they have formed it, which will offer an unprecedented vehicle with which to drain the remaining blood out of the Iraqi state. This is essentially an Iraqi Qatar Molambiya, referring to the construction arm of the Revolutionary Guard in Iran. That in that country has grown to mammoth size and infested pretty much every corner of the investment environment. And we're starting down that road now in Iraq today. So when I hear General Petraeus talk about how Saddam's regime was kleptocratic, autocratic, and murderous, my concern is that we're circling round in that direction, and that we simply have a different kind of dictatorship beginning to form in Iraq. Over the last 18 months, we've seen the creation of critical mass created when you take militia intimidation power, you combine that with a judiciary that will support whatever actions the militia requires, and then you use that to take control of the parliament and thus to form a government. For me, there's an awful circularity about this. The Iraq that we invaded in 2003 was an Iraq in which, there was no hope for democratic elections, in which freedom of speech was almost zero, where the opposition had been driven into external countries, where if you wanted to raise your voice against the regime, you had to leave to do that. And many of these things are coming full circle again. And I would say we're at the beginning of it. We're not, we're in the middle of it, but, it's beginning to accelerate. And so, if we were to gather on the 25th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, as I'm sure we will, I think the picture is going to be a lot more scary than it is right now. And I think that's going to happen very quickly. I'll just say that, Iraq, to many people, Iraqis foremost, Iraq looks much more livable now, right? It's more secure. It's cosmopolitan. It's got a rich culture and heritage of its own. The young people have are an exciting bunch of people to be around. Many of them can't remember the Ba'ath Party. Some of them can't even remember the Civil War days. it's got a lively feeling about it, with these, delightful little hints of New York, Washington, or Paris that, tends to make certainly external observers really, really happy that these things are happening there. But it's also a place where within the last couple of years, the regime has killed great numbers of domestic protesters when they attempted to stand up and change the system. It's also it's the place where we might have a peaceful transition of power, but the old government gets driven out of the country and pursued with lawsuits all across the world. It's a place where the corruption of the system is going to hasten both economic collapse eventually when the oil price drops, and ecological ruin. So, for me, I'm very worried about the trajectory. And what I'm probably most worried about is that the external facade is very appealing. The society looks like it's recovering. The government is very photogenic. But under the surface, I think we need to watch very carefully to look at the termites that are eating away at the foundation of the house faster than ever before. And the Mohandis company will be something to watch very closely in regard to that. A contract vehicle that is intended to be able to take control, to be given free land, millions of dunams of land across Iraq, cost-free, be given pretty much any ministry resource, including property, equipment, and funding, and for that to be run directly by the Iran-backed militias and feed into their strength. So what I worry we're going to see when we gather for the 25th anniversary of the invasion is an Iraq that in many ways resembles Iran. Not exactly, never will. Iraq's got a strong culture and differences of its own, but it's moving in the direction of an Islamic Republic of Iran with some important differences. It's not under sanctions, and it's an Iran with a US embassy. And that's what I'm worried we're looking towards now. That would be a very bitter fruit to come out of the first 25 years since the invasion. So I think we've got to watch what's happening under the surface within this government, and not just on the surface. I think, you mentioned that Sudani doesn't want to overpromise and underdeliver. Well, his spin machine is very effective. He is overpromising every single day. Mm-hmm. And, it's easy to overpromise when you promise when you say you're going to have the largest budget Iraq's ever had 3 years in a row, and you're going to spend down $115 billion financial reserves that Iraq's got. Anyone could succeed if they're willing to empty, the entire exchequer of the state and give it back to the people, or at least promise to. So, let's wait and see what really comes in the next couple of years. I've met Prime Minister Sudani a number of times, back even when he was the Maysan governor in 2010. Every time I've met him, I've liked him. He is a personable guy. He's thoughtful. He's a good politician. But when I look at Iraq, I don't see him. I see the crowd behind him. No pun intended.
Mm-hmm. That's the challenge, isn't it? As we're also talking to the general earlier, do we focus on the players, or do we focus on the game? I think the rules of the game, this muhassasa system, the patronage network, that everyone is in it to line their pockets, and then every seat in parliament translates to, like, quite literally a point system in which decides which ministry and what caliber of ministry you can get. I mean, sometimes, we in the Iraqi press, which is quite stinging and it can be quite funny at times, there were jokes about how, there was some ministry that no one wanted. I mean, I was part of a conversation once about, I'll say it, like Ministry of Justice. For a while, it was kind of a ministry that no one really wanted, and the reason was, you would think like it's a very important ministry in any country. They said, well, the only way you can make money out of the Ministry of Justice is through the food purchases for the prisons. But that contract has already been taken by X. And therefore, no one was really fighting over that particular ministry. This is the attitude. And those are the rules of the game. And I think, to me, Tishreen, the protest movement, was important because it was not against one group or one sect or one political party. It was basically a dam on all houses, to I guess quote Shakespeare, because people really want a change to the system. And then increasingly, we hear calls for amending the constitution, changing the election law, because I think Iraqis realize that the rules of the game are so rigged that you can have a good guy like Sudani or a good guy like Kadhimi, but it's only a matter of time until they start playing, scoring fouls. Anya, let me turn to you. I asked the general a question about how Iraqis get like agitated by messages out of Washington as a like over the past decade and a half. I mentioned the pivot to Asia. That was primarily the Obama administration, and then you had America First, and then of course now you have great power competition. Now of course they're warranted. Definitely, like you and I, we sitting here, we appreciate that Washington might be just like the American people might be tired of the Middle East. They're just focusing too much on the Middle East. A ton of investment, little comes out of it, even compared by American investments elsewhere. But as the general said, Vegas rule doesn't apply to the Middle East, and it definitely does not apply to Iraq. The example of Al Qaeda's defeat and U.S. withdrawal in 2011, and then of course they had to go back in 2014 because, in a way, mission wasn't really accomplished. So, in this kind of 30,000 view, and you follow this, and you've written extensively about voice that gets created, when the U.S. gets distracted, and who gets to benefit and who gets to lose, and implications for U.S. national security. I'm going to ask you the question I asked the general: what is the right level of balance that the United States should engage in the Middle East, or particular Iraq? I mean, invasion is one end of one extreme end, and then complete disengagement is another. What is the right balance that's going to be good both for Iraq and the United States, and not create vacuums that others can fill?
Sure.
That was a complex question.
Sure. Thank you, Bilal. I'll try my best to answer this. This is indeed a very complicated question, but let me start exactly where you started, which is with a 10,000-foot view. We heard the term great power competition several times in this conversation. So let me start with that. As you know, and as this audience knows, for the last several years, the trajectory of American foreign policy has switched from the primary focus on counterterrorism, which is where we've been since 9/11, to what we call great power competition. Essentially, it's another term for geopolitics, right? And the important thing to know about this recalibration or pivot, whatever is the appropriate term for it, is that I think we're still trying to understand what that means for ourselves. We're still trying to grapple with that, because our adversaries have never stopped looking at geopolitics as the primary driver of international relations, but we have with the end of the Cold War. And we're now coming back to that thinking. We're now trying to understand what that means. And to that end, what I've observed we try to do is, when we talk about great power competition, again, if you look at our national security strategy, right, it names Russia and China as top competitors. And the latest iteration of this document describes China more as a long-term threat and Russia as an acute threat. But one way or the other, we're looking at Russia and China. Those are our priorities. Where I think we're struggling to understand is how to engage in this competition. Because when we tend to think of it, we tend to compartmentalize it. We think of Russia, a competition with Russia primarily taking place in Europe, competition with China primarily taking place in the Indo-Pacific. But if we look at it from their perspective, they're looking at it globally. Russia and China are both looking at this competition globally. And the Middle East, historically, as you know, has been an arena of competition of great powers for several centuries. So from the Russian state perspective, I'm less educated to speak about China than I am about Russia. Certainly from the Russian state perspective, that never has changed, and that's not going to change. And in that sense, geopolitics from the Russian perspective are eternal. And the Middle East stands at this crossroads Therefore, when the Russian state is looking at this region and at Iraq in particular, it is looking at it from this strategic perspective. We remain committed to Iraq, certainly from a focus on counterterrorism, in terms of engagement when it comes to economic development, when it comes to democracy promotion, and so forth. But I'm not exactly sure if we fully understand the broader strategic level of engagement that we need. And that's because we're still struggling to understand what great power competition means for us and how to engage in it, and whether or not the Middle East is a distraction from this competition or in fact an arena of that competition.
So let me pick up on something you highlighted, and also ask you a question that I actually asked General Petraeus, and that was the question on friends. I'm going to have your take on it, Mike. From what I heard, the one case study that we have where we can basically look at a kind of petri dish and look at, okay, this is what great power competition looks at in the Middle East, is the Russian involvement in Syria. So the question is the one about friends. People look at Russia okay, when I say people, let me take that back. Leaders in the Middle East look at Russia and how it basically is willing to help the Assad regime kill the Syrian people, so the regime can stay intact. And I'm afraid that's very appealing. And I can imagine, a couple of, heads of states in the region who would love to have a friend like that. And that's not the kind of track record that, Washington has had as of late. So how do we square the circle? How can America have, good friends, in a way that, not only we define what good friend means, but convince them that that's actually a better way of having a friend than the Russian model?
So I think we need to start with a couple of issues. First, you had brought up the difficulty of doing business in Iraq, but also the importance of doing business in Iraq. In my own travels to Iraq in recent years, I have heard this issue come up over and over again, that Iraqis actually want more American business. They want more American engagement. And as you had mentioned, also to the point of friends, a perception in Iraq, right or wrong, a perception that the United States cannot always be relied upon, right? And when Iraqi leaders, when Iraqi officials look at Putin, they see a person who did exactly what he said he was going to do. He, in fact, said very little. He simply said Assad stays, and in the end, Assad stayed, right? So in a situation like that, from the Iraqi perspective, my impression has always been that Iraqis don't want to choose. They don't want to choose between Russia, China, or the United States. They want to have it always, essentially. And the best way for us to engage in this competition from a strategic perspective is to show, in addition to being a better friend, being a better ally, addressing these issues, is also to show that Vladimir Putin is in fact not as reliable as he might seem. We're now at a historic moment. We're living through historic times with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right? This is the largest invasion. This is the largest war in Europe since World War II, a refugee crisis that has surpassed Syria. We are looking at a long-term protracted war, but it is here, I think, that again we need to understand that competition is happening not just in Europe but also in the Middle East, and the more we can show that Putin is in fact not as reliable an ally as he might seem, the better our strategic position is going to be, and it's going to be hard. We have a lot of we have a big perception challenge in the Middle East in general, in Iraq, but also in the Middle East overall, in that our narrative simply does not resonate the way Russian or Chinese narratives resonate, and that is perhaps a good start.
Same question to you, Mike. This question of friends, because somehow it came up, especially over 2022. Iraqis were used to the Iranians were out there watching out for the interests of their friends, And in a way, many of America's friends and allies, did not feel the love out of Washington. And yes, we can like analyze and tell, like, look, as Anya said, yeah, different priorities for Washington, and America is basically out of micromanaging Iraqi post-election politics and whatnot. It was never really good at it to start with, so. But they take it personally. Iraqi leaders take the absence of messaging and push from Washington very personally. What do you say about that? How can Washington reassure its friends? Should it have friends?
Good question. So, the US and anyone in the Middle East has the friends that it deserves, right? Nothing's permanent, and you need to earn friendship and you need to maintain friendship. And the US is very focused on, in Iraq in particular, on explaining to people the kind of benefits that come from US friendship. But I don't know if the conditionality of that friendship is really clear to a lot of people, because they tend to get the benefits of that friendship no matter what they do. We are, I think, pretty bad at using leverage, and particularly really following through sometimes on inferred threats to people. We're also not particularly good at using the enormous intelligence advantage we have to be able to structure the incentives of individuals in the Middle East in ways that mean they see cooperation with the US, and, essentially doing the right thing in quotation marks, as good for them as well. And so, I think we are spending a lot of time talking to people, and that's great. You can't get, you can't do your job without doing that. Gives you a way of keeping contact with them, profiling their personality, gaining intelligence from them, and maintaining a channel to them. But when it comes crunch time to actually use leverage, we're obviously not as good as the Iranians at that. And one of the reasons for that is because they're very brutal. Now, in my experience working with people in the Middle East, and, I've done a lot of work at ground level, and I've seen Iraqis, including military and intelligence people, doing their work at ground level. Friendship often involves a degree of coercion. It's not an alternative to friendship. It can be part of a healthy friendship. You don't need to love everything your friend does. You don't need to agree with everything your friend does, but you have to accept that in the end of the day, they've shown you enough respect to structure the incentives properly so that you can work together in a way that's mutually beneficial. And I don't think we're skilled enough to do that anymore. I don't think we have the requisite expertise or the people who stay on station for long enough or the political bravery to do it. And as a result, I think we are, fighting with a sword made out of rubber. When it touches you, it just bends. And, that's something that could change over time. But, just talking to people and just offering to give them things and perhaps taking it away if they misbehave is not compelling enough. And so as a result, pretty much every one of America's friends in Iraq is at the very least looking for a new friend, and mostly have found them and will bend over backwards to please that friend. And that friend is largely the Iran-backed militias and Iran standing behind them.
But isn't it, isn't the fact that, as you mentioned, the US is just not good at making friends and keeping them. And even when we try to make friends and keep them, it's not the same language. Like, a friend basically in the eye of, let's say, of an Iraqi leader or Middle Eastern leader is, the way that Russia provides it, right? It doesn't matter. What do you want? You wanna stay in power? Yeah. What would it take? Battle bombs. Sure. poisonous gas. Sure, America's not going to do that. So by default, in the eyes of Middle Eastern partners, America is not going to be a good friend. But what America is good at is getting things done. We've been talking about, getting rid of Al-Qaeda just in Iraq, getting rid of ISIS. I'll actually posit another example. This banking reform that Iraq recently witnessed. For all, like I've been talking and writing about Iraqi agency and how the Iraqis are gaining a sense of ownership of the country, and they're holding their leaders responsible because the three problems that I mentioned, the militias, corruption, and climate, these are really Iraqi problems in search of Iraqi solutions. That dependency that once we all used to hear, you go to any Iraqi official and you hear an earful, maybe a laundry list of what they want and what they wish and what they desire, but that's actually changing and shifting. But all of that agency, I don't think would have been enough to compel the political leadership in Iraq to go from the dollar auction system that has cost Iraq, all the way between 200 and 300 billion dollars of laundered money into perhaps a more digital, modern banking system that's not only going to hopefully stop money laundering or limit, it's not going to stop it, but limit money laundering, make it possible to follow the money, which is kind of rule number one for fighting corruption. But it's also possible that actually allows Iraq to transition from a cash economy. Ahmed Tabaqtuli calls it cash is king, from a cash economy into a modern, digital economy. So that is still where the United States can be quite effective. It's not in supporting one group or one man or one woman. It's actually in imposing on the institutions, on setting the incentive structures. What do you say to that?
What I'd say to that is that, we are able to introduce institutional changes, particularly those related to technology in some way, that can sometimes sneak up on the players in Iraq, as this reporting change did. And in fact, it snuck up on the State Department. They were as surprised as anyone, I think, at the result of it when it finally rolled out and bit. And that required some explaining internally. But this is a good example of us pushing the Iraqis to do something that's in their interests, even though it's going to cause short-term pain to the corrupt elite. And it works, but it's got to sneak up on them. If they'd really understood fully the implications of that accounting change, they would have spent months and years undoing it. But it got through the net, and occasionally something like that does get through the net. With regard to what we're good at, look, another example is Mosul Dam, right? Did they get the Chinese to hurriedly, fix up Mosul Dam, or the Russians? No, they didn't. They got the US and they got European partners to work on that. And that could have wiped out Baghdad and numerous other cities on the way down the Tigris. So, we know what we can do, but the problem is this, the US is like a powerful engine. But we all know, if a powerful engine is in neutral, you put your foot on the accelerator, it just makes loud revs, but nothing goes anywhere. No axles turn, no wheels turn, no vehicle moves. What for me is missing is the gearbox. And that gearbox is diplomats who act like diplomats, but also who act like poker players, who act like intelligence officers, honestly, in the way that Russian and Iranian diplomats act. I think to some extent, they remember something that we've forgotten, which is that any kind of human relationship, particularly ones like this, where you're asking people to make tough choices, really tough choices, you've got to be tough in those kind of interactions. And being tough doesn't mean you stop being friends with someone in the Middle East. Being tough means as long as there's ongoing reason to cooperate, you will continue to cooperate. But honestly, I think what we come across as is nice suckers.
Anya?
All right. It's tough to follow the nice suckers comment, but I will try. Let me begin with the point that you made earlier, Bilal, that we are good at getting things done. And I think the truth is, when push comes to shove, when it comes to security, when it comes to hardcore security issues, when it comes to uh, uh, challenges that truly matter, I think Iraqis do understand that there's no substitute, for example, for American weaponry, for an American security umbrella. But that's only one piece of this story, right? Because the other piece is, you remember very well, during the Obama administration, weapons were when the Iraqi government was fighting ISIS, weaponry was held up for a long time, and then the Russians came through very quickly. So on the one hand, yes, we have some of the best technology. When we come through, we really come through, but we come through with delays, frankly, as Ukrainians have also discovered over the past year. And the fact of the matter is, sometimes you don't need the best technology. Sometimes you just need technology that comes quickly enough. It may not so much be a matter of being nice, but it's also a matter of having simply different systems. Our bureaucracy can be slow, especially when it comes to weaponry approval. It's very easy when you're one person like Vladimir Putin, and you can simply wave your hand and weapons will be delivered, right? And they don't have to be the best. I guess a roundabout way of maybe getting to your question about how to do this better is, as I've said earlier, we're relearning some of the lessons that we've forgotten. And I think, Mike, you alluded to this point as well in your comments, because during the Cold War, we did understand this issue of geopolitics slightly better. What I also want to add very quickly is that specifically, what in terms of what else we can do from a strategic perspective, Russia's invasion of Ukraine brought Russia and Iran as close together as they ever have been. We're now seeing a strategic alignment between Russia.
So you mean it has not been, the war in Ukraine has not been a distraction from Russian investment in the Middle East?
Correct. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was not. Russia was able to invade Ukraine and continue to engage the Middle East. In fact, it engaged the Middle East perhaps even more than it has been. Russia has remained committed to its position in Syria, and now it's looking increasingly at Iraq. Russia maintains energy interests in Iraq. And if Russia continues to be dependent on Iran, as we've seen it slowly verge in that direction after the invasion, again, from a strategic perspective, this gives Russia more access in Iraq, and that's something we need to be more aware of.
I think that's a very crucial point, Anya. Mike, I have a question that's probably suited for you. It's from Nisan Buri. Was the invasion of Iraq and the removal of Saddam more important for us than dealing with the hegemony-seeking Iran? Did we pick on the wrong enemy?
Well, I remember being in the US when the Axis of Evil speech was given at the State of the Union in 2002. And the list back then was Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. Probably in that order, actually. And the Iranians certainly seemed to be concerned after we went into Afghanistan that, we had the capability to do one other place in the Middle East. And it might be them. They were very cooperative back in that period. I'll never regret the removal of the Saddam regime, ever. No matter what came after it, which was not intended, of course. We hoped to remove that regime, which greatly deserved to be removed, as you well know. Anyone who had looked at Halabja, who looked at Anfal against the Kurds, the uprising in '91 and how that was put down, the misery caused by the Iran-Iraq war, and the invasion of Kuwait, they thoroughly deserved to be removed. Mm-hmm. Now, was the right time? Obviously not. Obviously not. We were up to our necks in Afghanistan, and there was no proximate need to, remove the Saddam regime at that exact moment. When it comes to Iran, ultimately, they did prove to be the larger threat, partly because we removed their natural predators, the Iranians, the Iraqi regime, and the Taliban. Right, so we accelerated the growth of Iran as a regional hegemon inadvertently. And, now when you look at them, they've done extremely well in Yemen, where they've helped a group of wannabe Islamic revolutionaries to take over basically the most of the country, and they're strengthening every day the Houthi movement. They have Lebanon still in their pocket, and Iraq is increasingly coming not under their control, but under the control of people who have a very similar mindset, very similar ideology, worldview. And that's the real regime change that they've exported. Our regime change was clumsy, well-meaning. Theirs is purposeful, highly successful, and not limited to one country, but to Iraq, to Yemen, and partially to Syria.
Mhm. Anya, let me get back to you on you mentioned something about how Russia and China might find common ground in the Middle East. So particular to Iraq, and you mentioned how Russia always looks at different aspects of its economy, its commerce, strategically, because they, unlike the United States, the business interest and the political interest, are not like they're more aligned in Russia than it is, let's say, in the United States. Russia has a footprint, especially in the energy sector in Iraq. How do Russian business interests, energy in particular, operate in a place like Iraq? How are they different from American businesses?
Yeah, and in fact, your question gives me another opportunity to answer your earlier question, because I've thought of a better way to answer it. When Lavrov, Russian Foreign Affairs Minister Sergei Lavrov, travels to the region, including to Iraq, including his most recent trip to Iraq, for example, he tends to come with a business entourage. And that is a fairly standard Russian practice. You can find examples of Lavrov going to Africa over 10 years ago with a large business entourage. When they talk to regional officials, they tend to find common language. They try to find issues that they agree upon. And so whereas we try to talk about the issues such as global warming at a time when a country's officials might be more worried about something more practical and more down to earth and immediate, Russian officials are more able to find something that they can agree upon. And again, that's true of Iraq. That's true of Russian engagement across Middle East and Africa in general. And that is also something that we can pick up on. If I'm not mistaken, and I may be wrong about this, but I believe French diplomats have also engaged the business community. So that's something that's a lesson for us as well. So there's a way we can do this. So Russians look at these issues from a very practical perspective and in a language that their interlocutors can understand.
So I have 2 minutes. I'm gonna spend it on asking that unfair question that I ended my interview with the general with, which is to look into the future. You already told me your ominous take on 5 years from now, but how about 20 years from now? I'm gonna ask it a bit differently. What would be the 2 changes that in U.S. policy that would nudge Iraq, because now we're going through a quiet time, right? That would nudge Iraq in the right direction in a fashion that next, like 20 years from now, we'll be talking about a more robust and resilient and solid relationship, rather than the cycles of violence and turmoil that we've been talking about. 2 policy recommendations that, if they were adopted today, it would put the U.S. Iraq relationship in a better trajectory over the next 20 years. Mike.
Well, one would be an intelligence finding that the presidential finding to combat Iran-backed militias in the country as a key threat to U.S. interests in the country, and indeed the future of the country, the stability of the country. So a kind of a long-lasting, slow-burning campaign using all the tools of national power, covert and clandestine primarily, to basically treat them as a cancer and to help Iraq to remove the threat of that cancer to whatever extent is possible, or to slow the spread of it, or to make it less malign. That would be one, and it might have already have happened, but I doubt it. The other would, I think, be a concentrated effort to ensure that the Iraqi state continues to build a peaceful, prosperous relationship with its largest ethnic minority, the Kurds. That is a real fault line in the country. And it's one that, if the Kurds are fully part of Iraq and satisfied with that relationship and the degree of semi-autonomy that they have, then they can be a very positive influence in the country. And Kurds don't like to hear this, but Iraq can in some ways be a positive influence on Kurdistan too. So I think the country is stronger together with its Kurdish and non-Kurdish regions working very closely together.
Hang together or hang separately. Anya, you have the last word.
Since I started, give me a second. Since I began from a 10,000-foot view, I'll end with a 10,000-foot view on great power competition in Russia, China. When we look at what we need to do to think strategically about Iraq, making Russia lose in Ukraine, showing that Russia cannot win this war, is going to be perhaps our biggest advantage in terms of showing that Putin cannot be a reliable partner.
Well, with that, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much. We heard good calls for rule of law, constitutionalism, federalism, and tackling corruption, and of course also being mindful of the balanced engagement with Iraq as guarantees for this relationship to remaining solid, not only surviving but also thriving. Then hopefully when we mark the next time we have a moment like this one, we'll be discussing more positive developments than we did today. So I want to thank my colleagues, Anya and Mike, and I want to thank General Petraeus again for joining us. And thank you all for joining us and for your questions. There were a few that I could not get to. My apologies, like always. We ran out of time. But thanks again for joining us. A recording of this event will be available on our website, the WashingtonInstitute.org. Again, WashingtonInstitute.org. Have a nice afternoon.